Welcome. This is our STAIR tailored professional development series. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about defining DBI, data-based individualization. So first we're going to talk about these three important elements of DBI, and you'll hear us referring to these elements a lot as we go throughout our professional development series for STAIR. First of all, we want to make sure that the data and intervention we're collecting is really systematic. You'll hear us talk a lot about systematic instruction, being systematic about the way that we collect data and also how we apply data decision-making rules. You've just heard me say data quite a few times now, and that's the second key component of DBI. We're making sure that we're really relying on data. We're trying to move away from making subjective decisions, really moving toward objective decisions based on data when we think about how our students are responding to the intervention and instruction that we're providing to them. And DBI, a key component, you hear it in the individualization part of it, is that we're helping to individualize instruction for our particular students who are most at risk in getting ready to take Algebra 1. You can read a lot more and learn a lot more about these elements of DBI on the National Center for Intensive Intervention website, which is right here, intensiveintervention.org. That's a great place to go to get additional resources, tools, especially in the area of mathematics. There are many additional lesson plan formats, ways to consider examining the fidelity of your instruction on that intensiveintervention.org. So three basic components of DBI that we're going to be talking a lot more about as we go along. Now we're going to talk about these primary components in more depth, and we're going to be talking about both assessment and instruction. A really great way, I think, to look at these components is to think about this model of DBI. This model is actually from the National Center on Intensive Intervention that I just referred to a little bit ago. So as we think first just about the assessment component, let's look at that one first. We think about these series of steps in the DBI model from the National Center. So first, we're thinking about that progress monitoring piece. And this initial progress monitoring is to determine whether students are actually responding to the initial standard Tier 2 or secondary intervention that you're providing. If they're responsive, awesome. We continue to implement that standard Tier 2 intervention, continue to progress monitor. If they're not responsive, this is when we move down to our next step of assessment, which is looking at that diagnostic data, collecting some additional data on their mathematics performance and progress, and then determining a hypothesis for what we might do to make a change. Following that, we continue to monitor progress for these students on a regular basis. We're going to suggest on a weekly basis for the students with whom you're working to determine whether that new change in instruction or intervention was effective for the students. If they're responsive, again, awesome. Continue with that, continue your course of action, continue to progress monitor and make decisions. If they're not responsive, we cycle back up, collect data, make a new hypothesis, make a change, and then continue this cycle. So in this way, we're using this assessment in a few different fashions in this DBI model. Next, we're going to talk just a little bit about the instruction that should be occurring as part of the DBI model. And you've heard me in the slide before really allude to these important pieces of instruction that should be in place. So first, we want that validated intervention program. We're hoping that that's occurring prior to starting this process. We want to know that there's already been some things tried at that Tier 2 or secondary intervention level. If students are not responding, as I mentioned before, so over here sort of on this non-responsive side, then we may need to adapt or make an intervention change. And this could be a subtle tweak, a subtle refinement of what you're doing with students, or it could be a larger change where we're actually taking out one activity and perhaps inserting a different kind of evidence-based strategy. So that adaptation is going to be a critical part of the instructional cycle. It's important to consider as we move along through this DBI process some characteristics of DBI, but also what it's not. And so when we think about data-based individualization, we're really thinking about it as a framework for making decisions. It's an ongoing, dynamic process for assessment and intervention. It really demonstrates the persistence that teachers utilize to move through and think about data, assessment, and intervention for their students. It's not a single intervention, a curriculum and assessment. We're not going to be referring to DBI as the intervention you're using. It's, again, back to a framework, a process that you're using to help really intensify and individualize instruction in mathematics for your students. So we hope you've enjoyed and learned a little bit more about defining DBI from this STAIR tailored PD, and we look forward to talking to you next time where we'll be sharing more specific information as part of the STAIR project.